We're up to 2 Samuel again. We're picking up from there, and we were looking at David's triumphs in the first portion of the book, and that was chapters 1 to 10, and it was really the establishment of David's lineage, because it was this covenant that God had made with Israel, as you'll recall. He made the land covenant. I don't call it the Palestinian covenant, as I told you, because there's no such word in the Bible. And it was a pejorative term invented by the Romans in the first century, so never use the word Palestine. But anyway, it's the land. It was Israel, and so there was a land, and there was with the Abrahamic covenant, unconditional covenant that included the land, the seed, and the blessing. And David, it was the Davidic seed, and the blessing would be the new covenant. And so we now enjoy that covenant as well, and it was established with David, especially in chapter 7. And so that's the Davidic covenant where he said, when David wanted to build him a house for the Lord, he said, did I ever ask you for a house? He says, I've never asked this, but instead I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to make a house out of you. And I'm going to make your descendants then a progeny that will be a line that will ultimately, as we now know, would lead to the Messianic inheritance. And so there would be one dynasty, and only one dynasty, in the southern kingdom of Judah, although there were 9 dynasties in the northern kingdom of Israel. Isn't that interesting? And indeed, if there had been one break in that dynasty, the Messianic line would have been broken. And there were a couple points where it came down to one child. There was one point where it was one child. Had that child been killed, and they tried to kill it. So the enemy is always against the purposes of the living God, and he knows enough about God's purposes to be wily and to focus on what is needful for his nefarious desires. If you can't get a person through one area, for example, he was a man of courage, a man of wisdom, a man of skill, a man of integrity. He was a warrior. He was a valorous man, and he had a great heart for God. And as you well know, he cultivated that heart in the wilderness when he was watching the sheep. So he had an incredible heart for God, and indeed it was spoken of him. He's one of those kings of whom it was said they had a whole heart for God. Even though, in spite of, and this was even after the matter with Bathsheba, but we all have legs that are broken in ways. We're limp. We all have brokenness, and we can all be subject and vulnerable to any number of transgressions. So we have to guard your heart and what you're focusing on, what you're thinking about. Because you recall then after his triumphs, his transgressions, and it was the sins of adultery and murder, which would lead then to troubles. So his triumphs were followed by his transgressions. And we're zooming in on chapters 11 and 12, and particularly 12 today, about his troubles. So you have a situation here where David then, at the end of chapter 11, you recall that this thing was displeasing to the living God, and because he basically, even one of his mighty men who was Bathsheba's husband, he even set it up where he would carry his own death warrant. David wrote this out and sent him with him to Joab. And the whole concept was that he was wanting to get rid of him so that this whole matter would be covered up, you see. But it wasn't covered up. And so when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. When the time of mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife. Then she bore him a son. But the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. We know that, but it's an important statement just to see that it's not like God doesn't know. And you can't have any areas where God is going to be blind. He'll know you through and through. And that's why I do like to say the one who knows you best is the one who loves you most. And that's nice. That's a good thought. Because the fact is, there's no skeleton in your closet he's not aware of. You see, you can't play a game with him. He knows you through and through. And so honesty and integrity before God is the key. But it's your thought life. Guard your thought life. Because you recall when it tells us that when he was... in the spring when kings go out to war, and he stayed at Jerusalem, Not necessarily that was bad. There were reasons why that might have been, but ultimately, though, he was in a position high enough that he would look down on the rooftops of other houses, and that's where he saw this woman. And I suspect it was a process. I suspect it was not just the first time thing, but probably a gradual process. And when you begin to play with it and toy with it, when disobedience or when a specific area becomes an option, you see, a specific step away from obedience becomes considered as an option, because we never fantasize about getting caught, as I told you many times. We only fantasize about the pleasures. Temptation, the deceitfulness of pleasures, temptation only presents its pleasures and never its consequences. But the wise person would be to think, what are the consequences, the long-term consequences of any action I'm taking? And if we're wise, we'll realize again and again that we've never flourished in disobedience. I don't know, I've never have. I'm not sure if any of you have. You might suppose you have. But you've always then found that in the long run, obedience to God, though you push back against it, was in your best interest in the final analysis. But here is a man who processed this, and it was a gradual decline. And remember, I've told you before, what do I say about men? That they often have, most men have sloppy thought lives. What's the second part? Flabby wills. And then the third, good for you. He's got anemic intentions, by which I mean most men they're not vigilant about their thought life. They entertain ideas that are unworthy of them. And it's what you put in your mind, it's what you read, it's what you look at, what you focus on, that's going to eventually shape your whole identity. And so it's critical then for us to have a thought life that we, again, Philippians 4:8, therefore he says, whatever is true, whatever is right, whatever is honorable, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there's any excellence anything worthy of praise. So that is what I want you to be zooming in on. And I've asked you to write that down on a card. Maybe some of you have, and if you have, it's a good reminder. You pull that thing out. What have I been thinking about? What does your mind go to when it's in neutral? It becomes a very critical thing. And at any rate, at this point then, she bore him a son. This means that he was unrepentant for a long period of time. Nothing happened. Hey, I got away with it. Nothing happened. And because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the sons of the men among them are given fully to do evil. What is that saying? Because there's not an apparent consequence, I got away with that, let me try a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And as long as there's not an apparent consequence, you keep on moving, and then you can deceive yourself, because you can diminish to a point where you say, how did I get here? I'll tell you how you got here. It was never a blowout. It's always a slow leak. It's always a slow compromise. So after this period of time, instead of him realizing what he had done, murdered this man, and basically this act of adultery and so forth, finally, after all that time, Nathan comes, the prophet. He's given an unenviable task. Would you like to go to an absolute monarch and confront him and say, what you've done is evil in the sight of the Lord? Being a prophet was a dangerous business, you see, because there could be very real consequences. And some of the prophets, as we know, were in fact persecuted. Some were murdered. And so there is, in fact, a danger. It's a dangerous occupation. Nathan did a very wise thing. He told the story, and that was the smartest thing he could have done, because he does it indirectly. And people love a good story, and Jesus was great with parables, wasn't he? And so this is a parable. So he came to him and said, there were two men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a great many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he bought and nourished. And it grew up together with him and his children. This often actually happened in the ancient Near East, where they would have, for some reason, one particular ewe would become like a pet. And that is not one, you never name what you're going to eat. They probably named that ewe lamb, you see. They weren't planning to eat it. But then what happened was, it was like a daughter, it was like a child. It's the strangest thought, but it would eat of his bread and drink of his cup and lie in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. He goes on to say, now a traveler came to the rich man. And he was unwilling to take from his own flock or his own herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. Rather, he took the poor man's ewe lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. So he steals that. This man has almost nothing, and he steals from his flock. Then David's anger burned greatly against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, surely the man who has done this deserves to die." Well, that's not exactly true. That's way beyond what the law would require. It would require a compensation of 4 times. But the point is that there is the guilt in David that's being projected in this story. So what's actually happening? When you find yourself protesting too much, you begin to realize it may be suggesting a projection, that you've actually been doing this thing yourself. And the things you hate the most are often indicators of things that are actually you're struggling with in your own life. And this is what's going on here. And so he was furious. Surely he must make restitution for the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and had no compassion. So let's stop and think about that. That's a pregnant moment, isn't it? It's an incredibly clever way, because ultimately David himself is the one who'll condemn himself, you see. It doesn't have to be the prophet who said, "You've done this, it's evil," but rather David himself has spoken it. So he said to him, "You are the man." Now that's a pretty powerful moment. You see, a parable is designed to do this. I had to wait. I didn't want you to see that in case you didn't know that. You're the man. Just think about it. Whoop! It's that moment. Here's what a parable does if it's done well. A parable has one point, you see, and one major focus. And when you get it, you get the point. In other words, you get the point not just in the idea, but you get the point. It hits you. You realize it was about you all the time. And so here, the realization that his fury was against himself, you see, and about his own evil. So he was exposed, and by his own words, he then acknowledged this. So ultimately, then he had to respond. Is he going to kill the prophet, or is he going to submit? So he said this, "You're the man." And then he goes on, now he can give the prophetic oracle. But suppose he started off with that, it wouldn't have gone so well. "Thus says the Lord God of Israel," now he can give him the prophetic burden. "It is I who anointed you king over Israel, and it is I who delivered you from the hand of Saul. I also gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your care. And I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added to you many more things like these. Why have you despised the word of the Lord by doing evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword." And you have to realize this Hittite, who was basically a repatriated Hittite, which was one of the enemies of Israel, somehow we don't know much about him, but he became one of David's 30 mighty men. So this is not an ordinary guy. It's somebody he knew well, trusted well. And so he betrayed. That makes the betrayal all the more intense. "You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the sons of Ammon." So again, he's alluding to the fact that he sent him, remember, with a note to Joab saying, "Put this man in the front lines." In other words, I want to get rid of him. And so he carries his own death warrant. And so effectively, David did it himself. It's as good as doing that. "And now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house." There was a consequence to that. You can sin at leisure. You can sin impulsively, rather, and then you have to repent at leisure. You have all the time in the world for repentance. You see what I mean? The act is so short, but the consequences have an enduring quality. And God, in his grace, sometimes has protected us from the full impact of the consequences of what we deserve. I know that's been true in my life. There have been things he's allowed me to get away with, but in a sense, and so have you, not getting full justice, but it was grace. And the point is, though, that if you are wise, you will heed what God tells you so that you become sensitized to the prompts of the Spirit of God. So it becomes more and more a process where you live coram Deo, is the phrase, before the heart of God. And the idea then is, now therefore the sword will never depart from your house. So there were permanent and final consequences to this sin. He'll be forgiven, but it'll never be the same again. And that is what I've seen in the lives of many people Christian leaders where they succumb to one immorality or another. And suddenly it's never the same. It's a permanent thing. Yes?
Yeah, Ken, I'm just curious how the Lord communicates or communicated with David. Was he speaking to him? I mean, these are pretty specific.
These are very specific things. Yes. He could have used his own voice, and there are times when he will speak, like as he did with Moses, and there are times when he'll speak directly to an Abraham and so forth. But in this instance, he chose to do it through the prophetic oracle. So it is God who, it is really, Nathan is functioning as God's mouthpiece to David. And so he's hearing this man whom he knew and with whom he consulted, evidently. Nevertheless, this was an unenviable task. And so it's a kind of a prophetic burden, and that he becomes the vehicle by which God conveys, the Spirit of God conveys that through his mouth. And then David has to receive that. And in his own spirit, he can choose. What's he going to do? He can choose to accept it or reject it. If he accepts it, then he has to repent. If he rejects it, then he's going to kill the prophet. That's why I say it's a risky business. Always start with a parable. Yeah.
Why would Nathan actually say what? Because the story speaks for itself. So I would have thought, other than to be brave and to take
what, that you're the man?
Yeah,
because that's the whole thing. He was called to confront David.
Right, but I mean, that was a brave thing he did.
Sure, it was. And I don't know what inspired him to give this story.
But the story.
He was stalling.
David, right?
No, he was brilliant. That was a brilliant move, really.
You could have just, and David would have recognized it, right?
I don't think so. David still didn't get it. He didn't get it because why? How long has he been covering it up? At least 9 months. The child is born. It's a long time. Figure it's about a year or whatever it is. That's a long time. You harden your heart, and you're not able to hear the word. And after a while, then, you become impervious. You become dull. You're not able to hear the Spirit of God who speaks to you, prompting with small, quiet words, you see. But remember C.S. Lewis's wonderful aphorism? You'll know it. God whispers to us in our pleasures, He speaks to us in our conscience, and He shouts to us in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. If you're smart, you'll listen to the pleasures. Smart, wise, enjoy the pleasures, the fellowship with friends and music and beauty and goodness, nature. Enjoy that. He whispers to you, and often we don't hear Him. We don't acknowledge Him. Acknowledge Him in those little things. But then He'll speak to us in our conscience. But if we're not careful, we can sear our conscience. You can dull your conscience. And in fact, there's another degree to which a person can go and actually have an evil conscience, when they take the high moral ground on saying what is right is wrong and what's wrong is right. Isaiah 5:20, they call good evil and evil good. I think it's happening today. You may. There's a collective context in which that's occurred, where there's this notion that people take the high moral ground, on vilifying what the Scriptures affirm, and affirming what the Scriptures vilify. And they think they're moral, that they have the moral ground to do it. Why? Because it's an evil conscience. They took a natural capacity that we all have. We can't get rid of a conscience. But if you continue to violate it enough, after a while, you have to rationalize it, and eventually it'll change. Your actions will affect your attitudes. You see, 9 times out of 10, if there's a change in an action or an attitude, what is it going to be? People will not change they're going to continue to do what they want to do, and they'll modify their beliefs to conform to their behavior. We are wonderful at rationalizing. Remember these 3, and there are multiple. I always just limit myself to these 3 defense mechanisms. You know what they are? One I just gave you, projection. You take your sin and project it on others. The second one is rationalization. And the third is denial. It wasn't me, you see. And those alone, without the other ones we have a collection. Just those alone make a man basically have a virtually boundless capacity for self-deception. Boundless. It's amazing. But it's by gradual degree, you see. It would be too much all at once. But the slow degree, a little. Yes?
You know, I was going to say, it's also interesting to God.
Nathan. I think that David probably would have accepted this message differently from a stranger.
Yes,
Trusted Nathan, and Nathan used that trust to be able to.
that's right, John. I think that's right. That he chose Nathan because Nathan already had a relationship with him, and he had a prophetic role in that administration, in that culture. So there's no question that there was a trust relationship. Whether God was the one who gave him that parable, or whether Nathan said, "I've got to get this," I can't just say it right off the bat. I don't know, but one way or another. But you see, what would it take to prod the heart of a man who's covered it up that long until after a while the carapace of illusion is so thick that you can't even penetrate it? It took a parable to pierce through that armor of self-defense. But you have to be very careful because it's so easy to rationalize. That's why, as I've said before, if you do not have someone who, with whom you are honest enough to convey your deepest temptations and trials and so forth, someone that's trustworthy enough that you name that demon for what it is, otherwise it has a power over you, unless you invite accountability, because you can't impose it, you have to invite it. Although then there's the problem of people who have accountability, or so it seems, but they didn't. They had the illusion of accountability with a bunch of yes men surrounding them. So it's always easy. Again, we can trick ourselves. But there's a psychology to this that I think is very profound. So he says, the sword will never depart. You've despised me, and you've taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite. You see, what you did against them was what you did against me. And to turn that around, by the way, do you see that what you do to serve those in your life as your service to Jesus? You see, when I make meals for Karen, I'm seeking to see that as my service to Jesus, you see. Therefore, I will do it well. I want to do it really well. Now, I love her, but at the end of the day, if I construe my service to her as my service to Jesus, it will, because as you well know, I've said this multiple times, if I love Karen more than I love Jesus, then I'll love her less than if I love Jesus more than her. She would become the enemy. But then the amazing thing is, when you love him first and foremost, he's not an enemy of the other loves. He energizes and animates them, doesn't he? Because then, the more you love Jesus, the greater you can love another person, not the less. That's the marvelous wonder here. And you can see this is consistent. This is why I tell people, it's far better to love Jesus than to avoid sin. You see, pursue what you want. Stop trying to avoid what you don't want. Again, everyone does this. They spend most of their time trying to avoid what they don't want. It's not going to go away by extinction. You have to replace it with a better good. So I need to have that accountability and honesty and integrity, and it is the heart is the issue. Guard your heart. But I have people who know my deepest struggles and who have been invited to ask me how I'm doing in those areas. You would do well to do so. David didn't have such a person who didn't penetrate that. Why God allowed this to happen? Why did he allow the child to be born? Why did he not send the prophet beforehand is a mystery to me. But it was apparently the fruit, the consequences were palpable, the physical fruit of that action. So it becomes a concept. As soon as you entertain a thing that you know is wrong as an option, as soon as you begin to entertain it, it begins to become concretized in action. It has more of a possibility of actually being, what the term is, reified, brought into being. You see, it's in your head. I'll tell you, you think about some option about what I might do to this person, and if you continue to entertain it, it's more likely to occur. So we are there's a psychology to this that I think is very profound and timeless, because in spite of the fact that this is 3,000 years later, human nature hasn't changed a whit. Circumstances have. So that God is always there, but somehow we have a greater fear of people than we do of God. And that is why we're more afraid of what people think in that respect. Even he knows darn well that that was not right before God. I mean, he was a man who wrote these Psalms. He was a man who loved God and pursued him. But he allowed this thing to begin to change his whole psyche, because when there's a discrepancy between belief and behavior, 9 times out of 10 people will change their beliefs to conform to their behavior. I'll let you process that. I think that's what we're into right now as well. So someone calls it the pelvic area. The heart, what we want. So we want to have this action. We want to have this, and after a while, we're going to modify our beliefs to conform to our behavior and whatever it happens to be. It's astonishing how we can suddenly do it. Let's move on. And so he says, "I'm going to take your wives and give them to your companion. He'll be lie with your wives in daylight," and so it would happen. And you did it secretly. I will do this thing before all Israel and under the sun. Doesn't that remind you of a text? The things that you've said in secret will be proclaimed. In other words, at the judgment seat of Christ, somehow all will be made known and be revealed. Thank God there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. The judgment seat is not one of condemnation because he bore it. The one who is in fact that you're going to encounter, the one who gives you meaning, is also the one who would judge you unless he bore that judgment himself. So here we'll have it, but still I think we will see at that time. And if you were to see him, if you were to go to Jesus tonight, if you were to die or he took you, I tell you that the first thing you'd want to do would be to have that removed, that thing that Paul calls the flesh. Get rid of it. But I'd be terrified to be going through it. I'm not looking forward to going through that process again, because it's going to be an awesome moment. And will I see my sin for the first time as Jesus saw it? That's an interesting thought, seeing it as God saw it. And secondly, will I see the sin of unused potential? At any rate, I will do this thing, so that's why we want to live wisely and well. I've done it, so the Lord has taken away your sin. You shall not die. So God has granted him forgiveness, but the consequences will continue. And there's a text of Scripture, in fact, that I allude to here on the section that relates to this, and it's 1 Corinthians 10, 11 to 12. And it's this text that makes this passage particularly meaningful to us, because it tells us, speaking about the prophets and so forth, let's not try the Lord, don't be as idolaters, and all these things happened as examples in the Old Testament for us, so we would not crave evil things as they also crave. In other words, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is a real revelation of God's history with his people, but it also reveals lessons for us that are timeless. And so he says, nor less act immorally and so forth, but don't try the Lord, nor grumble as some of them did. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for whom? Our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Then he adds this important wisdom. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. You think, I'm pretty good in this area. My sentence doesn't in fact fit my flesh pattern. My flesh signature, as you all know, I've given it to you more than once, the 4 components there. These are the ones. So those are the 4. You already know about this. It's in my book, Conform to His Image. I know none of you suffer from these problems. But the problem with anger or revenge, and for some reason, I don't know why, gambling's never been a big deal with me, but and that kind of addictive behavior. But don't think that you're immune to it. If you think you stand, take heed lest you fall. Be careful. So remember, I have 4 words that correspond to these. I've given them to you before. Instead of anger, I choose the word gratitude. I replace that. I can't be grateful and angry at the same time. Instead of seeking revenge, I give grace because I was given grace, not revenge. Because and then the glory of the person of God and the person who made it, and then coveting goodness. But my only point about this, I don't want to go into that, is to see.
I've got a question. What would have happened if David would have recognized his sin before Nathan came to him and repented? Would God have been so severe?
It's impossible to know. I mean, because to be frank with you, God had no right. He had done this action. The fact that he put it off that long, whether that enhanced the consequences, I don't know. But we have this idea we got away with it, and I guess God's not looking, and so that's why.
Which is part of the lesson is confession of sins quickly.
That's correct. There's a term that they use in some churches. They say, keep short accounts. Have you ever heard that term? Keeping short accounts means you want to do and ask the Spirit of God to prompt you, to teach you, and to make something real to you. That is to say, when I think about the handbook, for example, I have in the handbook to prayer, I always, on the confession thing, have in this process, I hope you're trying this out. If you haven't used this, I'd love you to try it, handbook to prayer, but ask the Spirit to search your heart and reveal any areas of unconfessed sin. Acknowledge these to the Lord and thank Him for His forgiveness. Now, if I do an archaeological dig into the strata of my subconscious motivations, I'd never come out alive. But the fact is, you're asking the Spirit to prompt, and the Spirit never convicts in generalities. You're a bum. You'll never amount to anything. I'm tired of you. Rather, the Spirit will say, child, we need to work on this. And so the Spirit, so let the Spirit do the searching, and He will reveal a thing. And when you respond to that, then He can give you more light. But He won't give you more light until you respond to the light He's given you. So that is really, I think, a key thing to invite that. Become short accounts. To do not give a long time in between the events that we're talking about here, because it would be a terrible danger to do. But so the text goes on to tell him about the fact that all these things will occur as a consequence. And so he lost, the child was lost. The Lord struck the child that Uriah's widow bore to David so that he was very sick. David therefore inquired of God for the child, and David fasted and went and lay all night on the ground. So this is after that confrontation when David acknowledges that. And before I go further, perhaps I should also mention Psalm 50. Yeah, I think I will. Psalm 32 and Psalm 51 relate to our text here as well, because these are David's response. And so in Psalm 51 in particular, it even gives the superscription. When Nathan the prophet came to him, pretty specific, isn't it? And that superscription is actually part of the inspired text. So we know this is incredible because it's for the choir director. What does that mean? This is going to be done and sung in the tabernacle as part of Israel's worship. Can you imagine this? He is now revealing to all what God has revealed. You see this? Yes.
So Ken, why do we as the church continue to try to hide our sins instead of doing what James tells us by the Spirit to confess our sins to each other?
Yes.
And to pray for each other so we can be good.
I think it's
How would that vulnerability change something?
That vulnerability it's incredible because you see there's a stubborn pride and there's a desire to always look good. We're so concerned about people's opinions, we want to make a good appearance. So what would happen if I revealed this to a friend? Would he accept me? And so again, it comes down to those kinds of components as well. But we all need somebody we can trust well enough that we can ask them to invite us and reveal those things to us. If we're not, we're living shallow and thin lives because we're not hearing the prompting of the Spirit, and then we can continue to go further and further until we get caught. Or until it's so embarrassing that you can't go further. Some go beyond that. So the church isn't doing this, but yet this is an obvious example for us to apply because we need that level of honesty and integrity. Notice what David is doing there. Knowing that he writes a psalm and says, "Be gracious to me according to your loving kindness, according to the greatness of your compassion. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. I know my transgressions, my sin is ever before you. Against you only have sinned against and done what is evil." Yes, didn't he sin against Bathsheba and Uriah? Yes, but ultimately all sin is against the living God. That's why Jesus said, "I forgive his sins." They said, "Who but God can forgive sins?" And they were right. Suppose one of you, I saw one of you stealing something from another, and the first one sees it and say, "Wait a minute, you're stealing that thing." Says, "No, let him alone. I forgive him." Who are you to forgive him? It's not against you. Jesus is claiming that all sin's against him by have the authority to forgive sins. But the point is that he said, against you, ultimately your sins are going to be against the living God. And he forgives us far more than we have been invited to forgive others. There's no sin that is a person or an injury that a person hasn't given to you and you haven't sustained that's as bad as what we've done against the living God. It's a hard thing for us to buy into. But he says, I was brought forth in iniquity and you desire truth and so forth. So he actually speaks about this. And hide your face from my sins, blot out my iniquity. Restore to me the joy of your salvation. And if that wasn't enough, he also did it a second time. And in Psalm 32, he also speaks about this event. And he says, how blessed is the man whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. And when I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted away. But your hand was heavy, my vitality was drained. And I finally acknowledged it, and then I said, I'll confess, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Now, what's significant about this whole matter, though, is I'd like to call to your attention. This is from Talks of the Bible. And what I have here is, when we look at the theme of this book, just to give you an overview here. So if I look at the theme, as I say, there's no real break in the narrative between 1st and 2nd Samuel. There were one book but they illustrate the hostility between the northern, the 10 northern and 2 southern tribes. Hard to keep them united, and they finally split in 931. But the point here is the candid portrait of the strengths and the weaknesses of David's 40-year reign. It's very open, very honest about this. He's no respecter of persons. And the heroes of the Bible, like David, are not glorified to the neglect of their sin. And this is, again, a realistic vision. This is one of the evidences in my mind. This isn't something that if you were just making it up. You wouldn't make your heroes have feet of clay, would you? So it's a matter of revealing that even a man after David's own heart could do such a thing. That's the incredible thought. There's no boundary to his forgiveness, but at the same time, don't suppose with arrogance that there will be no consequences. He's no respecter of persons. And so the heroes are not glorified to the neglect of their sin. And so the idea is the cause and effect principle, of course, in every book since Genesis. Obedience, what does it do? That's chapters 1 to 7, brings God's blessings in chapters 8 through 10. And disobedience, chapter 11, leads to God's judgment. The consequences sin when it's full grown brings forth death, in this case, many. And so what happened then is, I won't go into the text, it would take too long, but what happens then, the consequences, they continued. Absalom then, after this, rebels against his father, and he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Then it was so bad that David had to flee from his own city. And then Absalom set himself up as king, and he would have been ruined. But God keeps Absalom from pursuing him until David has time to regroup his forces. He's defeated and so forth. But all these things take place, all these things, even the concubines that Absalom, again, just as Nathan said, it'll be done in public. And so he really repudiated his father. And then he sought to, but more conflict breaks out between the 10 in the north and the 10. This leads to war. And Joab, the closing actual chapters of this Bible are really summarized, and they show how intimately the affairs of people are tied to the spiritual moral condition of the king. And so this whole idea, the nation Israel enjoys blessing when David is obedient to the Lord and suffers hardship when he's not. So what you have then are consequences of this matter that really yield this issue that we're seeing again. When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your Father, I'll set up your seed after you. This is a promise that was still not broken. God's promise is unconditional. Ours, even when we violate our commitments to Him, He does not violate His. That's very significant. This was an unconditional promise. In spite of his disobedience, this is what would take place. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So in spite of that, then, he continued. But what would it have been if he had not done this? So what we see then is the concept here in chapter 11, his tragic sin with Bathsheba and Uriah. We see then the honesty and the integrity of this. So we see the kingdom was established, the kingdom is consolidated, and then Israel is united, and then Jerusalem becomes Israel's capital, And as we anticipate moving forward, we're going to discover that this is Jerusalem in the time of David. And then when Solomon would come and he would build that magnificent temple, it would very greatly expand, and this would be an image of the Solomon's palace and the temple. And so it was a great thing. So the incredible thing is it was through Bathsheba that he would have this child. You see, shows the grace of God in spite of his rebellion. Bathsheba would have another child, and it would be her son, not the others, who would rule and reign. So grace upon grace, you begin to realize, is far more. You can't out-sin the grace of God, but you don't want to presume on his grace, you see. So this whole idea that anticipates this great temple, and we can only guess what it was really like, but it was, I think if it had been known by the chroniclers of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, it would have been included, because it was a wonder. And a magnificent appearance that this was indeed. And so Solomon led the kingdom, as we're going to see, to its zenith until his own rebellion. So again, you see the process. God will continue to honor you beyond merit, beyond desert. But at the end of the day, there are going to be consequences to our actions. And so we have to recognize that there are needs for us to actually see what our lives are like. I've never shown this to you. I'm going to show this to you. I just feel prompted to do this. There's this thing that's called the kintsugi, the ancient art of broken pieces. And I think this is actually relevant for us right now. So I've never presented this before, but most of us would like damages to our broken items to be concealed and hidden and repaired so the object may look like new. But the Japanese art of kintsugi follows a different philosophy. Rather than disguising the breakage, this restores the broken item by incorporating the damage into the aesthetic of the restored item, making it a part of the object's history. So what's happening? They took this broken vessel and they repaired it with gold. Is that not an interesting thing? And there's something about that, you see, that I think is fascinating about this. The art of repairing products with gold or silver lacquer so that it's actually more beautiful for having been broken. What does that tell you about your own life, you see? This is an incredible, here's another example of that art, where it's actually more beautiful than it would have been if it hadn't been broken. You see where I'm going with this? In my view, in spite of our rebellion and disobedience to God, that brokenness will be there, but God will heal it. And when we and the hardest times, whether it's because of something that we did that caused the affliction and brokenness, or whether something happened that was not your responsibility, but it happened to you. Maybe it was the malevolent intentions of others, maybe any number of things. But when we all go through adversity, it's my view that an hour in Jesus' presence would be more than worth 80 years of adversity. I'm quite confident about that. I don't think, if you were asked after an hour of being with him, would you be willing to spend another 80 years of misery? I'm not saying it's all misery. No, there's joys and so forth, but it is a sadness when we recognize the diminishment of our own vitality day by day. It happens slow enough so we accept it, you see. But the painful, obvious nature of this is that we are the morbidity of decrepitude. And if we're not wise, if we do not grasp that, again, age conspires with God to transfer our hope from the temporal to the eternal, we're not being wise at all. Understand that. But recognize as well, it's inviting us to have an aspiration for home. And I think home is going to be something like this. In that metaphor, and I know I've given this to you before, but it's worth hearing it. Again, what's the metaphor we hear about the tapestry? You've all heard that? Remember the tapestry, that God is weaving a tapestry. It's your life. And when you are working on a tapestry, the top side looks, of course, appropriate. But the bottom side, if you were to see it, would not look good at all. It would make no sense to be distorted colors and tangled threads. So all, in a sense, that what we see is just the bottom of the tapestry, in a sense. Although God gives us hints of what the top looks like when we read the scriptures, and we know what is really true. But we still live in this present darkness, so that we find ourselves to be pilgrims and sojourners who are spiritual beings having this earthbound embodied experience because we're being prepared for home. My conviction then is when we stand before him, it's almost the idea of him for the first time seeing heaven's view, and we see the tapestry as God saw it. But what I add to that metaphor is this. It's my belief that the most lovely patterns, the most complex and beautiful structures in that tapestry will have been woven, you'll discover, in the times of your greatest pain in this world. You wanted to be perfect, but actually what the potters thought was perfect wasn't. It had to be broken to be perfected. It's a wonderful idea. You see, here's another example of it. So what brilliance, what genius it was to redeem a thing and to actually accentuate the pain. That is why David wrote Psalm 31 and 51, 32 and 51. Because you see, he's showing this kintsugi, he's showing this process, and showing that to us, what that looks like. The brokenness that we have in our life, you see, is now repaired in a way that we could not have ever imagined before. So I think that's a wonderful metaphor for us to consider. It's a metaphor for our processing. Wait till we see one another, and the most beautiful parts of you will have been forged in the times of greatest adversity. Hard to believe that, because I have my own idea what my best interests look like. And I often disagree with God about what that looks like. Maybe you've noticed this as well. But I've always found that what I thought was my best interest in the past didn't turn out to be so great. And so it doesn't work for me. If I submit to him, because I don't know what my best is. What would you have to know your best interests? You'd have to be omniscient. You'd have to know the future. You and I, we see three options before us, and you judge according. This path seems to be the best one. I want to go that way. We even pray that God will take us that way, you see, and open up the door and so forth. What if it is actually you can't get from there to there? You want to get to A, you want to get to B, but you can't go straight to B. You have to go to something in between. B turns out to be C, D, or F by the time you get to it. There are other pathways that get you to it. What I'm suggesting is that only God can see the outcome. We see the appearance. He sees the outcome. You'd need to know the future. Why is it then that we suppose that we have a better plan than God? When in the fact how have our plans worked in the past when they've defied him? So it's amazing how, in some ways, we are dull of hearing. We're not really clear in our thinking. There was another, yes, Leonard.
David is clearly a central figure in the Bible, and many times as I've read the Bible and read the stories, specifically the stories of David and Bathsheba, what I've never seen before is that he publicly admitted his sins in these songs. Mm-hmm. That's an aspect of David's character I never understood.
It's incredible to think that he actually created these two songs, and to the choir director, they're to be sung antiphonally in the Israel's worship. That's because even that tarnished thing will honor God. That's my point here. It'll honor God because the brokenness will actually honor him in a way that otherwise would not have been the case. That's how I have to see it. And that when I look at it that way, that makes a big difference, doesn't it? It just affects my understanding. But it's, again, an evidence of the authority and the amazing love of God that he would provide this for us, this exemplar. We see it works. If we'll only listen to his voice, if we'll only heed his ways, these are all examples for us to learn. Now, all of us have suffered consequences in varying degrees. The wise person, though, would seek to live in such a way that the outcome would be pleasing to God and therefore less injurious to ourselves. Although still, I will say this, and we can't deny this truth. It's in 2 Corinthians that we have to turn. And when I go to 2 Corinthians 12, he says, when I encounter persecutions and difficulties for Christ's sake, but when I'm weak, I'm strong. So there are going to be times when he takes you to the end anyway. Not because of something you've necessarily done. Or as 1 Peter puts it as well, in 1 Peter chapter 4, when he tells us, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you which comes upon you for your testing as though some strange thing were happening to you. To the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing. So he's saying that even that suffering, whether self-inflicted or not, you see, but he goes on to say, if you're reviled for the name of Christ, you're blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. I love this addition, though. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or thief or as evildoer or troublesome meddler. That's not redemptive suffering. You see, that's not the way. That's not the idea. I'm suffering now. No, it's a badge of honor. No, if you do suffer as a follower of Jesus, you know that God will bring it about. That He will make it a thing that will honor Him in the end. So that to me. So I'm very glad this metaphor came up. Yes.
I've always struggled with this. I mean, they're sitting there talking. Solomon writes Proverbs 31, talking about the greatness of having a good wife, and he's got 1,000 wives and concubines. He was keeping a harem. I mean.
I'm amazed at what God put up with, to be honest with you. You know, remember he told them in Deuteronomy 17, when you appoint a king, you shall not multiply wives or gold and silver or horses, money, sex, and power, but rather he shall be a man of integrity and a man of the law, that he will actually write a copy of the Levitical law, of the Mosaic law, in his own handwriting and do it before the tree. He would be a man of the word and accountability. Not a one of them ever did the thing they were supposed to do, but they all did that, sometimes in spades. Solomon's philosophy of life is a little is good, more is better, and too much is just right.